It's the second seminar in the Knowledge Exchange seminar series that's jointly sponsored by Queen's and the Assembly, specifically RAISE. Just to give you a bit of background on how this seminar series started, Queen's and RAISE came together and wanted to promote the idea of evidence-based policy making and lawmaking in Northern Ireland. So they introduced the series as to afford an opportunity for people academics to present their research findings that are germane to local issues that would hopefully facilitate the business of the Northern Ireland Executive and Departments and the Assembly. So today we have Mr. Mike Nesbitt here. He is the chair of the Committee of the Office of First Minister and Deputy First Minister, and he's graciously agreed to come along and provide some opening comments before Queen's Professor Mike Tomlinson's presentation. Thanks for coming today. We appreciate your interest and we hope to see you again.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to look at my clock because I've been asked to do a maximum of 5 minutes and I've been told that 7 times. So I've also been told when I'm speaking as chairman of the OFM committee, that's okay. But if I switch to be leader of the Ulster Unionist Party or an MLA for Strangford or whatever, to make that abundantly clear. So I'm starting as OFM chair, okay? And I want to say thank you very much. Welcome, Mike. I think this presentation and discussion is key to what we're doing in this Assembly in this session. Poverty, and particularly child poverty, were high on the OFM-DFM Committee's agenda last time, although I wasn't here for that debate. I'm determined it will stay high this time for as long as I'm chair of the OFM-DFM Committee. Can I just say, on a sort of semi-technical point of information, in March of last year, the Executive had a statutory obligation under the Child Poverty Act to lay a strategy before the Assembly. We were considering that strategy at committee level. We've written to the Department stressing the need for an action plan with a Northern Ireland focus which would ensure delivery against that strategy, because as we all know, you can spend a lot of time writing high-end strategy papers, but unless you've got a delivery mechanism and unless it actually makes an impact on the ground, there's very little point having a strategy. So we are continuing to focus on the need for action. We've written to the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister seeking an explanation why the report which is required under that Act has not been laid before the Assembly within the time frame it was to be laid out. The report sets out the measures that are being taken by departments and the effect of those measures towards meeting the Child Poverty Act targets. Now, I understand it's not a departmental issue, it's an executive issue, and the report is due to go before the executive today, and so I would expect officials, if it's approved today by the executive, to come to the OFM committee shortly so that we can interrogate where they are. No doubt measures of poverty and development of policies to address it are complex enough, and research has an important role to play in ensuring we properly define the problems of poverty and adopt an evidence-based approach to tackling those problems using the limited resources that we have available to best effect. Now, last November, Dr. Stephen Donnelly, some of you know, the senior principal statistician at OFM-DFM, briefed the committee on a substantial and innovative piece of work that he was undertaking based on outcomes-based models on poverty reduction. All I would say is, in my layman's terms, he convinced me that a little change, a little additional income into a family can go an awfully long way. And now I'd like to speak just in a personal capacity as an MLA and perhaps as leader of the Ulster Unionist Party, because I did kind of walk into a bit of a firefight within 24 hours of being elected by saying I wanted to learn more about areas of multiple deprivation because I didn't particularly understand what we were talking about. And a lot of people thought that was a mistake of mine because as an elected politician, I should understand all these things. All I would say is in one of my previous roles, I was a commissioner for victims and survivors. And one of the big pieces of work that came out during my time there came from the Eames Bradley consultative group in the past. And if you look beyond the £12,000 recognition payment, which made all the headlines, you actually had a very substantive report into how to deal with the past, with some very good underlying principles and some good ideas for how to drive a process forward. And at the core of that was the use of the word reconciliation, an emphasis from that group on the need for reconciliation. And the challenge that I put out then, which I put to you today, is, have we got a common understanding of what the word reconciliation means, of what that concept means, of what it requires people to do? Because I could take you to some victims who've lost loved ones who feel what it means is you expect me to go and hug the gunman who murdered my loved ones. And I don't believe that is a definition of reconciliation. I think reconciliation starts in here with an acceptance of what has happened to you. But that's my interpretation. And so it is, given the past 2 or 3 weeks that I've had, it's very affirming that Mike's going to come and challenge whether we have clear understandings in this area of poverty and of deprivation. And all I would say is, from my point of view as an elected politician, I think to give a commitment that has real meaning, it has to be based on 2 things. One is knowledge, and the other is understanding. And I think the knowledge comes from what we're going to hear from Mike today, and then the understanding comes from embedding yourself on the ground and seeing what it is like to live in poverty, to live in an area of multiple deprivation, and to have a clearer understanding of what we read and what we see in PowerPoints actually means on the ground. I was, and I will finish now, I was in Tigers Bay last night meeting a group of people, all under 25, who had asked to meet me, and it was quite depressing. It was quite depressing to listen to them. We met in a room, we talked, they said, after about half an hour, they said, would you mind coming and taking a look at what we're talking about, the bit of housing, it's just up the road? And I said, of course not. And we walked up the road, they said, you're the first politician I ever remember seeing walking up this road. That's just wrong. So let's have the knowledge that Mike provides us, and let politicians go out and get the understanding which together add up to commitment. And I look forward, I'm probably not going to be able to stay for the Q&A, but I certainly look forward to your presentation.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you, Eileen, for the invitation to come up here. I'm presenting on behalf of a team, quite a large team that's involved in a project. There's a local team attached to this, a Northern Ireland team, one of whom is in America at the moment, some of whom are in Dublin with some of the graduate students that are attached to the programme, learning about child deprivation indicators, and one who was due as a witness in court today, but luckily that meeting was cancelled, Professor Paddy Hilliard. He's part of the team, and he's been able to join us unexpectedly. So welcome, everybody, and thank you for coming to this seminar. It's very important for us as academics that we hear about very, very close in the discussions and debates that you're immersed in, both political and policy type debates and some of the technical debates. It's very important to see how we can contribute to that, both in terms of argument, evidence, and data. And what I've brought is you've got a presentation in your pack, this PowerPoint presentation. You've got a paper, a written paper, which has the key data in it, the heat chart and the first results of the Omnibus survey, which is at the core of the discussion today. But I've also brought with me some bulletins from the project, which are sitting on that table. There's one inside the other, okay? Just a couple of slender things which inform the discussion and try to bring various policy documents, research documents to bear on our own work. So please help yourself to that. And moving on to the title of the presentation, Defining the Breadline, Is There a Northern Ireland Consensus? Well, I can very quickly say that if you're interested in the answer, you can leave now. The answer is very simple. Yes, there is a consensus. But I think if you want to stay and hear about what lies behind that consensus and some of the issues that the data that we've collected that express that consensus, how they feed into the arguments that are going on not just within the UK, not just in Ireland, but within Europe at the moment and beyond. I have to say, this is the first time I've ever had to compete with the soundtrack of the Titanic. I hope, can everybody hear all right? Yeah, okay. There is a considerable debate going on specifically around this theme of deprivation indicators, the things that people are missing and how that signifies a person or a household's living standards, whether that household is an elderly household, whether that household has children, or it's a single-person household. And we all know that single-person households are becoming ever more prevalent. Well, before we get to the results, I'm going to start with a bit of background about the project. We can be very quick about this. This is not just a team from Queen's. There are 6 universities involved. Those are the universities, and there, in terms of follow-up information, is the website, poverty.ac.uk, if you want to track what we're doing and explore a little bit further. And I think it's important that we realise that this issue is not going to go away. The issue of poverty, social exclusion, whatever words, whatever language you surround this issue with, it's not going away, and it's rising up the political agenda precisely because of these kinds of factors. The international financial crisis, the austerity that is informing budgets in Europe, and now the emerging politics around that. When we come closer to home, the role of the UK state, which is to be pegged back to a level of intervention below that of the United States. That is the commitment of the Westminster government at the moment. All the specifics of the Welfare Reform Act, which I've made a calculation will reduce the living standards of everybody on benefit by about 600 million. That's what it's going to take out of our economy and out of low-income households' pockets. We do actually have evidence that shows that Northern Ireland was the only area where wages and salaries fell between 2008 and 2009, whereas everywhere else it increased. There was actually a dip down, and it's bounced back slightly. So there's twin pressures of rising costs and threats to people's income, whether people are in work or not. And we might add something that is not on there, the big political debate that is going on about income inequality and the whole issue of the fairness, particularly the fairness of the incomes of the very rich, the 1%er. So, this is a very political issue that we're dealing with, and that ensures that our close attention to the issue of poverty, social exclusion, deprivation, and so on is guaranteed a political focus. Very quickly, these are the formal aims of the Poverty and Social Exclusion Project, which I'm reporting on today, or one stage of which I'm reporting on today. It's about measurement and improving our understanding of all those different concepts: poverty, deprivation, social exclusion, standard of living. We're particularly concerned to see how things have changed to equivalent surveys that were done 10 or so years ago. And we have a commitment to engage with policy, to come up with policy-relevant results, to try to inform the ongoing discussions at whatever level those discussions are occurring, as to how best we can make a difference to the lives of those who are particularly marginal in society, both in income terms and in social terms. I'll go a little bit slower here because some of what we're doing is specific to Northern Ireland, okay? So we have our concern with the dimensions of equality. It's important that we fulfill our obligations to understand how these things vary according to the dimensions of equality set out in Section 75. So that's one of the specific commitments that we have. It's important that we're able to make comparisons between ourselves and other places that people are interested in making those comparisons for, whether that's north-south, whether that's east-west, or whether that's broader European comparisons, or even beyond that. And that's not as simple as it sounds, because everybody does things differently. They measure income differently, they equivalize it differently, they put it together with deprivation items differently, as we shall see. So we have to have the capacity to be able to convert our data into the measures that are commonly used to inform policy in the South, or EU silk standards, or in the UK, or wherever. The other thing that's of interest, and it was important that Mike Nesbitt talked about the legacy of conflict there, because one of the distinctive features of the poverty and social exclusion survey work that we're doing gets into exactly this territory. How does the experience of the conflict, as measured by questions on how close were you to violence of one kind or another, how close were you to death and injury, how close were you to witnessing violent events? And we have ways of trying to capture the intensity of that experience, and then relating to, how has that kind of shaped people's positions in relation to disability, their exclusion from labour market, their standard of living, their social position now. And there's a lot of talk around these issues, but not an awful lot of evidence that can inform them in a systematic way. So that's one of the things that we're able to do by asking these questions. Sensitive stuff, the first time we asked this in 2002, 2003, I think it's fair to say there was a lot of resistance to talking about a survey of poverty that included experience of conflict as well. People wanted to say these are entirely different questions, and we were saying, no, they're not. They need to be brought together. And I think the evidence from 2002, 2003 is that there is a poverty and social exclusion imprint. The conflict has imprinted on those dimensions of poverty and social exclusion that we talked about last time. I suspect that effect will have decayed to a certain extent, died out literally in some case through premature death, through suicide, through people leaving, and so on. I expect that effect to have decayed somewhat, but no doubt it will still be there. So I've got the interview schedule with me on that particular module if you're interested. So what have we been doing? We carried out some focus groups. It's very important that people that are responding to surveys understand what we're talking about, and we understand what they're talking about. It's also very important that it's not experts' views of what the necessities of life are inform this kind of work. So it's important to have a conversation with groups of people and pitch certain items at them and say, well, do you think it's important? Do you think it's a necessity of life in Northern Irish society that people have an annual holiday of a week away from home, for example? 1 week's holiday. It's a modest standard. Do people think that is a basic necessity? Well, you can look at the data and find out on that, and that there's various views. So it's important that we were talking to focus groups. Secondly, we have carried out an omnibus survey, which is an opinion poll, and that's mainly what I'm talking about today. What do a sample of the population think of various items and activities? Do they regard them as basic necessities or not? That was the opinion poll. We are doing qualitative interviews with families, low-income families. We've carried out, I think the latest number was 49 we've got to, and the focus there is particularly about families, family supports, family networks, exploring the view that family is stronger in a place like Northern Ireland compared to other parts of the UK. So we're exploring how family support, wider family networks work when people get into difficulties, when they face crisis, particularly material crisis. And then we have a main survey which will take some of the items that we're talking about that we've opinion polled and actually record whether people have these or not. So this is where we get the record of enforced necessities from. So we've got a main survey, and I'll elaborate on that in a moment. We're also working with local communities. We're working with some partnership organisations to try to have a constructive conversation about how the expertise and the work involved in the poverty and social exclusion survey can be of assistance to people who are on the receiving end of some of the changes and the lowering of income standards that we've got at the moment. So we're working with groups to train them how to do focus groups, how to record things over a period of time so that we actually learn very directly about people's experiences on the ground, and to try to encourage people to kind of stand up and speak about things as they are at the moment as part of the evidential basis of the project. This is extremely difficult work. People are hugely reluctant to come forward and say, I'm in this very difficult position at the moment, or things have gone wrong for me. And I think that's something we may want to pick up and discuss, why that is going on, because I think there's a huge stigmatization process that's going on at the moment, which encourages people to blame themselves for the situation that they're in. And there's not a lot of kind of moderating ideologies around at the moment. So that's one thing we might want to talk about. But that's what we're meeting in an everyday level in terms of encouraging people to talk about the situations that they're in a public way, and to voice that as a public issue, turning the private trouble into a public issue, if you like. These are the domains in the main survey, and you'll see that it's a very wide-ranging survey, and the Central Survey Unit already complaining to us that the survey is too long. I think that means the invoice is going to be somewhat bigger than we expected it to be. It is a very comprehensive survey. It is on the back of interviews that have already been done as part of the Family Resources Survey, an extremely important survey that was only introduced in Northern Ireland in 2002-2003, which allows us to capture the income and employment position of people, and indeed has some deprivation record attached to it. So people that have already been interviewed from the Family Resources Survey have said they're prepared to talk to us, and so they're being re-interviewed. So we have their income and household data, and we will have all of these domains explored with people as well, including the experience of the Troubles, the Northern Ireland only module. So if there's anything you want to ask about that, hopefully we can answer it, what we're looking at there. Now let's get down to business in terms of the deprivation indicators. Why are deprivation indicators important? The discussion of this goes back at least 20 years, but it was underpinned very much by the United Nations Summit on Social Development in 1995, where 117 countries, including the UK and Ireland, signed up to a commitment both to measure poverty in its two kinds and to draw up anti-poverty strategies. So this is a big international commitment. And Ireland was one of the first countries in the field to go for a definition of what they called overall poverty, which was based on a purely income measure, a low-income measure, and consistent poverty, which put items of deprivation, ask a household, okay, you're a low-income household, but do you still have a fridge? Is your washing machine broken? Has it gone and you're not able to buy another one? We put the low-income status with a record of whether people are deprived of a list of items, a consistent poverty measure. And you'll see from the paper that Ireland started out with 8 items, and if you were missing one and that was coupled with a low-income position, you were in consistent poverty. They changed that in 2007. All of the European Union countries in 2009 signed up to a commitment to measure poverty in relation to low-income and deprivation indicators where people lack 3 out of 9 items. Okay? So let's just have a look at a country-based example, Ireland 2007, with the European Union example. This, in the paper, this is putting tables 1 and tables 2 together. And what you see highlighted in sort of muddy red colour as it's coming out there is the only 2 items that actually correspond. So here's the European Union recommending for all of the 27 member countries that they should use this list of items, and there's Ireland using that list. We're peddling a particular view of how one should go about measuring poverty, and it's called the consensual approach to measuring poverty, because we try to root our method in what the majority think is an appropriate standard of living for the society that they're living in. So instead of appealing to experts and all their statistical techniques, we go out to communities and we ask them what they think is the break point between an adequate standard of living and poverty, basically. So we're asking people about the basic necessities of life, and from that consensus view, so if a majority feel that an item is necessary, it may qualify to be in our index. It may qualify to be one of our indicators, but not necessarily, because we have to look to see whether it has any statistical power in terms of when it's combined with other indicators. Does it actually allow us to discriminate between standards of income, material standards of living at different points? If it doesn't, because everybody has it and nobody cares about it, well, people might care about it. Take a colour TV, it doesn't have any discriminatory power. Why record it? Why have it in your list of indicators? So that is the kind of area that we're in terms of this discussion and the collection of the evidence. So in the Omnibus survey, we tested 76 items. 46 of these related to adults and the remaining 30 related to children. And it only took us about 3 days of debate, certainly 2 days of intense debate and some residual time to discuss these items and to come up with agreement as to what they should be. And some of the considerations was it was essential that we were able to compare with other surveys. If they're collecting that or they collected that historically, it's important that we have it and we can demonstrate that it's either useful or it's not useful. So we wanted to do that. It's important to recognise that standards and expectations change. So there were long discussions around mobile phones, access to the internet, a computer at home, the differences between adults having this and children having this for doing their homework and so on, and other things. And to what extent we were just trying to measure changes in consumerism and the extent to which we were actually really measuring changes in expectations around what are the basic necessities of life and a standard of living. A lot of the debate was around food, a lot of the debate was around clothing, and a lot of the debate was around changes and trying to understand changes that are taking place in people's expectations and actually ownership of things. And we have a lot of survey data to inform that. And that's a recognition that expert views are not always the same as popular views. The other debate that we engage in is whether we're interested in the explanatory power of indicators regarding the entire spectrum of income, or whether we're only concerned to cut off the poor from the non-poor, right? What are we trying to achieve here? Do we want, if you like, a standard of living index whereby, politically and otherwise, we can all relate to being concerned about standards of living across the whole community rather than picking off the bottom 10, 15, 20%, that our tools, if you like, are able to perform that explanatory function. So there's been considerable debate about that. At the end of the day, you've only got a survey of so many questions, so eventually there have to be some pretty pragmatic compromises about what can be reflected and what can't be reflected. But that's just to let you into a long, arduous debate about indicators and what goes in. The main innovations, after all of that, was to put in a question about all recommended dental work, and I think that reflects the changing delivery of dental services. Hair done or cut regularly, and we'll have more to say about that in a moment. Table with chairs at which a family can eat. Well, you can see those items there. You've got the complete run-out of the results. You've got the scores of what the 1,300 people that were interviewed from a representative sample of Northern Ireland. You've got that in your paper, not in these slides. You've got it in the paper, both in the form of a list or a chart which is split over 2 pages in a somewhat confusing way, I'm afraid. And you've also got it in the form of a heat chart, which we'll come on to in a moment. Now, let me just point out a few interesting features of the results. 11 of the adult items scored 75% or more, so 3/4 of the population or more are saying these things are basic necessities, absolute necessities that everybody in our kind of society should have. And if they don't have them, we're regarding them as deprived, okay? That included the dental work, fresh fruit and veg daily. So some public health messages must be getting across insofar as that scores highly as an item. Then we have 12 items that are in this kind of 55 to 74% zone. 55%, it's a safe majority, 55% there. And interestingly for Northern Irish society, it's unlikely that the results from the English, maybe it'll be different in Scotland and Wales, but it's very unlikely from the English survey that this will score highly. 56% of people saying that being able to attend a place of religious worship is a necessity. It's very interesting. And I was giving a presentation for Emma, who's sitting at the back there, in Dublin last summer, and revealing that as an early result. And people were kind of adamant that this was nothing to do with poverty. And surely there are no expenses involved in going to church. You know, you can just turn up in anything these days and nobody minds. And there was a very interesting discussion as to why that should be defended as being part of the deprivation index. Well, it probably won't survive all the various tests, and particularly if the heathens in England get involved in this, because it'll likely be 20% who say that that is an essential item. Table and chairs, interestingly, qualifies here. Sport and exercise. So a couple of the new items are coming in there. Contents insurance. And then we get to some items which are very borderline. And this is very interesting in terms of how rural much of Northern Ireland is, and how a lot of communities and a lot of households are very dependent on cars rather than public transport, just because of the nature of the place. There is relatively high car ownership in Northern Ireland. Used to be far less so in urban areas, but that has changed lately. So we've got these borderline items, and it's unclear whether they will qualify in our final index or not. And then we come on to things like including, should a holiday 1 week away from home be regarded as an essential? Should people be able to replace furniture when it wears out? And people are saying basically, no. We regard that as a desirable, not as a necessity. And yet, if you go back to table 2 in the paper, or you go back to that other slide, 1 week's annual holiday away from home is in the European Union's 2009 agreed list of indicators, but it's not coming out as qualifying on the consensual definition. and so on. And then we get to the computers and so on. Then here are some of the children's items. Time is running on a bit, so I'm going to skip on this. I'll just make one point about that. There's something quite interesting that emerges about the way people are much more prepared to assert the needs of children rather than the needs of adults. So if you take, in Northern Ireland, right, we have one of the lowest figures for access to the internet from home, households having access to the internet. We have a figure of 61% of households have access to the internet, as measured in 2010. It's a bit old, but that's the position, and it's the lowest of any of the regions within the UK. Okay? So what does our survey say? When you ask people, do they think it's a basic necessity? Only 30% say it's a basic necessity for households, thinking about this in the context of adults. When it comes to children, and we say, is it important that people have access to a computer and the internet to do their homework? Suddenly the figure goes up to 60%. So there seems to be a bit of a contradiction there. And it's not explained by the younger and older groupings. So there's a few interesting things that are beginning to emerge from this when we bring the child indicators into it. But we get a very similar figure in relation to holidays again, slightly higher in relation to children. Okay, so then we come to the crunch question. Is there a consensus on necessities? Yes, there is, and that's why you've got the heat chart, so you can just scan that and see that that is the case. You've got Catholics, Protestants, people with a disability, people without a disability. You've got older people, younger people. You've got people at various points in the occupational spectrum. And broadly speaking, they're saying the same thing about what are the basic necessities of life. However, there are some exceptions, and here's some of the ones that I've pulled out. You can play this game at home in your own time and look at what the exceptions are. But if you take 2 pairs of all-weather shoes, but on the whole, most people are saying the same thing, okay, except when it comes to older and younger people. This is where the big division is, and this is why DWP and other statistical, the Office of National Statistics via DWP and other statistical offices have talked about and have developed separate indexes for older people and younger people. They've developed a separate indicator, a set of indicators for pensioners. And they've done so in a couple of interesting ways. They've asked the question about why you don't have something in a more sophisticated way than has been done in the past, trying to get at that concept of you don't have this not because as an older person you're less consumerist or you're less assertive about your needs, which is definitely true. No, I'm quite warm enough. Oh yeah, you're going to bed and wrapping up in a coat at 5 o'clock in the evening and you're saying you're okay. We might define that as fuel poverty, and an older person is saying, no, I'm okay. I'll sort this one out. So that is what you're dealing with there. So there's a very distinct difference. So we principally ask about enforced deprivation in the sense of, can you not afford it? Do you not have this because you can't afford it? But there's a lot of other questions that DWP are now asking because there's other reasons as to why you may not have this in an enforced way rather than as a matter of preference, okay? An adaptive preference, as we call it. So this is the DWP index, and the latest findings on the proportion of people living in households who have this thing. Those are the figures, the 99, the 72, the 95, the 60, the 89, and so on. And there is our findings of the proportions of people who think these items are a necessity. And again, we come across a discrepancy between how we're measuring the deprivation of older people and what popular opinion in Northern Ireland is saying as to whether this is a majority item or not. So go out socially at least once a month. It's in the deprivation index for pensioners. Only 28% of our respondents said that that was a basic necessity. So that's what we're dealing with in terms of the difference, if you like, between a popular consensual view and what experts suggest should be appropriate to be in a pensioner's deprivation index. And there's obviously other examples there. How are we doing for time? I'm nearly out of time, aren't I, really? Okay, so I think I've mentioned most of the issues, but what people are grappling with, first of all, is do we need just an overall deprivation index, just one measure of poverty, or do we need separate sets of deprivation items for pensioners and for children and everybody else? Another debate, and this is one for statisticians and academics probably more than policymakers, is whether we weight the items or not as a way of trying to factor in that, say, 80%. If 80% of people say that 3 meals a day is a necessity, is that item not more important than mobile phones at 40%? Well, obviously it is, but does it make any difference to actually add a prevalence weight to it or not and come up with a score? So, you know, there are those kinds of arguments and discussions going on. There's just a record of the deprivation rate at EU silk level. That's the kind of the direction of travel. Increasingly, people are not talking about a relative income measure. They're actually producing, as required under EU silk, a deprivation rate. So this is the rate of the population that lacks deprivation items, standalone deprivation items, so 2, 3, or 4. And there's obviously different things that you can do with. The EU standard is 3 out of the 9 items. Then we have the debate that I've already indicated, a consensual approach versus an expert view. This is a way of putting those issues in a diagram. On the left-hand side, we've got low income, and there's a lot of choices as to whether you're looking at severely low income, 50% of the median. Do you take the UK median? Do you take the Northern Ireland median? Do you take before housing costs or after housing costs? All of these issues are tricks to either increase the poverty rate or lower the poverty rate. In terms of those numbers, it's important that one understands the basis of the figures that we're using. So various measures are used, 70, 60, 50, and all the rest of it. Then there's the question of the deprivation score. Do we just have deprivation, or do we have severe deprivation? Do we move from 3 items to 5 items or 6 items? So that there's that going on and being built into various measures. And just to illustrate that part of this debate is that deprivation indicators measure different things and different people than the income measure to some extent, but there is an overlap between the two, and it's that overlap that is captured in the Republic of Ireland's measure of consistent poverty. It's bringing those two things together. So we do actually need both things because they are talking about, to some extent, they're talking about different groups of people and measuring slightly different things. So some of this, by way of conclusion, some of this is about technical issues. It's about the tests that we run to see whether the deprivation items are valid. Do they add anything to the analysis? If they don't, what are they doing there? We don't need them. And are they reliable in expressing the underlying concept of poverty and social exclusion that you're trying to get at? And there's a lot of statistical procedures that can be run to fulfill those requirements. On the policy front, as I've already said, do we have one measure or do we have multiple measures? Why doesn't Northern Ireland develop its own measure? Does it go along with the DWP measure? What are Scotland doing on this? That they're following very much the DWP practice by the looks of things. And then we come on to the more interesting questions, which you'll now enliven the discussion with. How can deprivation data inform priorities and targets? And what is the use of this work to low-income neighbourhoods, who we're engaging with in a conversation to try to understand how things are panning out for people on the ground, and whether we're missing any tricks in terms of what do people actually economise on first. And we can see some of this in the data. We know what goes first for people. But some of the people we're talking about are way beyond what goes first. They're really in survival mode now, and we're seeing more and more of this in terms of food banks, people literally going hungry, people very cold, and simply having to find warmer places than they've got in their home, or having to go to bed, basically. So there we are. That's all I'm going to say for now.